Leonard Lawlor is Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Philosophy at Pennsylvania State University. He specializes in 19th and 20th century continental philosophy. He's known for his writings on phenomenology and the figures like Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, Michel Foucault, Henri Bergson, Maurice Le Merleau-Ponty, Edmond Husserl, and Jean Hippolyte. He has written prolifically on phenomenology, contemporary French philosophy, but amongst his books are, to name but a few, Imagination and Chance, 1992, Derrida and Husserl, 2002, Thinking Through French Philosophy, 2003, The Challenge of Personism, 2003 again, The Implications of Immanence, 2006, That's Not Sufficient, 2007, and From Violence to Speaking Out, 2016, which would be the main focus of our talk. I hope it was correct, like my introduction. I mean, some of the books I didn't mention. You have written prolifically many articles.
That's fine. No, those are my single author books, actually, all of them. So that's fine. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
So the first question is that your most recent work and focus concerns transcendental violence and possible responses to it. From Violence to Speaking Out, the book that we're going to discuss today, published in 2016, contains ideas introduced in your 2007 book, This Is Not Sufficient. In that book, and through the implications of Derrida's work for the problem of animal suffering, it is shown that the suffering of animals in today's world is an utter injustice. Your book, From Violence to Speaking Out, takes up the question of responses to violence. Why a book on violence? I know it's a very broad question, but what brought you to writing on violence?
Well, for better or worse, I mean, I'm probably more a Derridian than a Deleuzian or a Foucauldian, or a Bergsonian, I guess. So, Derrida wrote his essay in 1964, Violence and Metaphysics, on the work of Levinas. And I mean, a lot of people have read this book and written about. I've read this article and written about it, but it is crucial for understanding Derrida's work, even though he's very young at that age, at that point, and he's 34 years old when it's published. So, but it is important for orienting your understanding of Derrida. But it's also the discussion of transcendental violence there. I really took to heart, and it's informed a lot of my writings for the last 20 years after Derrida and Husserl in 2002. But I was wondering if you wanted to, I don't know if this would be worthwhile for you. I was thinking that maybe the question you had about phenomenology and its foundation might be a good place to start. I enumerated the questions you sent me. It's question number 7 in the list you sent. So what do you think about that? Because I think it would orient whoever hears this about what's at stake in the material I wrote for the book. Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely. I'm just like, I mean, you can start with that question if you like. I mean, definitely. For me, they are related. Yeah, sure, definitely.
Well, I mean, I do count myself as a phenomenologist, although most phenomenologists don't see me as one. But there's 2 insights that I think are crucial for at least Derrida's work, and one is how I experience others. So what Derrida stresses again in Violence and Metaphysics is the experience of others is always mediated, so that I don't have access to your interior life. I can't feel your feelings. I can't think your thoughts. So they're always mediated by language or bodily behaviors. So that's a really important insight for Derrida, because it means, on the one hand, and this is really what's at stake in the book, for me to even help you, say if you're poor and you're begging for money, and for me to even help you, give you money, you would have to enter my sphere of experience. But according to the way that Derrida interprets Levinas, that would be an act of violence, because it would violate the fact of your alterity, which is preserved always by the mediation between you and me. But again, that's a paradox of the experience. There is no way for me to help others unless I do this kind of almost silent violence to you. So I would call it almost insidious violence. So so the book is trying to deal with that kind of paradox. But then the other phenomenological insight is into the experience of time, which is much more complicated. And I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but it's just important. I mean, the easy way to understand the insight is there's no experience in the present without a memorial aspect. There's always some role of memory in it. But memory, of course, is a form of mediation because it's a representation of absence. So the same problem of mediation appears in the phenomenological tradition, but also for Derrida and Deleuze as well. Experience of time is fundamental. It's what determines all human experience. So you have this problem of mediation in two ways: my relationship to others and my relationship to the present. So always mediated. So and the mediation, is a way of preserving the alterity, but then the mediation also puts you within my sphere of experience, which again, Derrida following Levinas is a kind of violence, which Derrida calls transcendental violence, but what I call that, I just follow him in calling it the same thing, transcendental violence.
Right. So, I mean, if I'm not wrong, you talk about transcendental violence in the book, and also, I mean, like with all the introduction and the background, philosophical background, you also talk about the worst violence, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, right. Of course, that's how I said the problem of the book is through the worst violence, which Derrida really doesn't talk about very much. It is in Violence and Metaphysics. And I know it's a very paradoxical idea as well, because it might sound like, well, anyways, worst violence would be a complete apocalypse, where there'd be no violence whatsoever. But violence is always going to be this attempt to have experiences, which means a reduction to sameness. So on the one hand, there's no violence is irreducible, but also it's the only way to maintain the future. I mean, all three, Derrida, Deleuze, and Foucault, and maybe this is too reductionistic, but it's basically true, are concerned with the preservation of the future, keep the future open. So they're anti-teleological thinkers, they're not like a Christian teleology towards paradise, or I guess all the major religions have this idea. But they want to keep the future open as unpredictable. And with events coming at us, French avenir is the French word for the future, which means literally to come. So they want to preserve the to come. But there would be no to come if there was complete nonviolence. So, but maybe you should intervene at this point.
The other question I had was that that is perhaps a bit like intuitive, but aside from the pioneering work of people such as Walter Benjamin and George Sorel on violence, it seems that thinking about violence has been an increase in philosophy. If it is true, why is it like this? I mean, generally.
Yeah, I was wondering about that as well. I'm not really sure. I think it's safe to say that for the group of philosophers writing in the 1960s, which include Levinas, his first major book is published in 1961, right? They're influenced by the event of the Holocaust. So, which is a radical form of violence. But you're right, there's been a proliferation of writing on violence, especially among Anglophone philosophers. And I'm not sure what motivates it. I mean, I would think one thing is the increasing consciousness of sexual violence, which was a sort of, not very public form of violence, sanctioned frequently by laws of countries, like within the marriage. There was no way to charge a husband with violence against the wife. So, but that's really changed in the last 20, maybe 30 years, where It seems, especially in the Western countries, everyone's really sensitive about this form of violence. So there's been a lot written on sexual violence. And if I can confess, I mean, a flaw in my book, and one that's made me very, which has actually made me think I should have withheld the book from publication for a couple more years, was it doesn't really talk about physical violence like sexual violence. It maintains itself. The book is maintained at the level of the transcendental or the fundamental. The only way I engaged with real violence, if you remember the preface to the book, I quote Judith Butler, and where she's very interested in linguistic violence. And Derrida, too, is really interested in that as well. And linguistic violence, as you know, I don't know if in the States we call that hate speech. And that's so that's the only real violence that I sort of intersect with. But again, I have no discussion of hate speech in the book. I just mentioned it in passing. But you can see how this would work. One of the ways that language is a form of violence is it's impossible for me to speak to you without using general terms like human, woman, man, the races, white, black, whatever. But these generalizations, which again cover over or violate your singularity as an individual. So again, the attempt to respond to violence that I was having in the book was a way of speaking that would respect the singularity, the alterity of the other, without immediately going to general terms, you know.
Right.
So I hope that's relatively accessible. Yeah.
It is, yeah. Thank you. Just like, I mean, another interesting part of the book, I think, already in the preface, as we said, is that it is a quote from you. We must reveal the falsehood of the idea of the end without remainder. We must stop thinking that we can get rid of violence once and for all. To desire to get rid of violence once and for all implies wanting to get rid of potentiality once and for all, end of quote. Drawing on an exploration of 1960s French philosophy, as you mentioned, you seek a solution to the problem of the worst violence. First of all, what is the idea of end without remainder, and how do we relate it to the problem of nihilism?
Well, yeah. I mean, this is the word unrest in French is found in Derrida and Deleuze. And again, it's the idea that if there's no remainder, then there's no more potentiality, and the future is closed off. I mean, I can give you a sort of Deleuzean response to how this would look. And I hope this is, again, understandable or easily understood. But Deleuze frequently, you know, he writes out mathematics all the time. And I'm not a student of the differential calculus, which he invokes almost in every book. But an easy way to understand what he's talking about is to think about irrational numbers. So like the ratio of pi, you know, in a circle is an irrational number that if you represent it numerically as a fraction, it produces an infinite number of remainders. But that infinity, you know, it's like our future. It has to remain open. So that's why he talks about remainders. So there always has to be another remainder, you know, produced by the irrational ratio to keep the future open. Derrida thinks, you know, so I hope that's relatively easy to understand. But Derrida thinks that through the idea of iterability, the future remains open. So he says, you know, whenever we speak, if we think we're done with speaking, there's still the memorial aspect of that speaking, which can be repeated, and therefore it keeps the future open. So, but again, to refer to sort of the traditional religious outlook of you know, paradise, then a fall and a return to paradise, that's really an attempt to close off the future and have no more remainders. So, I mean, again, all three, this is easy to say about Foucault, but all three philosophers I mainly work on are philosophers of power, but not in the sense of overpowering, like pouvoir, in French, but the idea of puissance, potency.
Mm-hmm.
So they really are trying to preserve the idea that there's still potency to produce the future. So yeah.
Right.
I didn't address the nihilism question though.
Yeah, yeah.
If you want me to do that, and
Sure.
and that was a little bit surprising to have that come up. But I mean, this period of French philosophy is the high watermark of French Nietzscheanism.
Mm.
So it is relevant. But nihilism as an idea or as a cultural diagnosis really comes about as with the decline of religion. Nietzsche's God is dead in the 1880s, and but it really means the end of transcendent values.
Mm-hmm.
So especially, I mean, this is pretty clear in Deleuze, but also in Derrida. It's an attempt to think about immanent values, not transcendent values. And of course, the assertion of transcendent values immediately means that you're, again, thinking about an end, where we have a goal of perfection. Mm-hmm. And once we reach perfection, mm-hmm. then, as people would used to say, then history would be over. There'd be no more future. Mm-hmm. So, but nihilism really refers to the elimination of transcendent values, mm-hmm. which opens up this really large question of what do immanent values look like. So,
one of the thank you. That was absolutely comprehensible and clear and beautiful formulated. One of the concepts that you just touched in the beginning of the book, but then later on, I don't see that much of it, is the globalization. You talk about globalization in the beginning of the book, but then later on, I don't know. Could you please elaborate? I mean, it's a very spontaneous question, but could you please elaborate the relation between globalization and these sorts of violence that you deal with in the book?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, I mean, the idea would be that globalization, I'm not sure everyone would agree with this, but globalization looks to me to be the Americanization of the world. And so again, I mean, so to preserve the singularity of cultures, there should be some sort of opposition to globalization. But just in the 6 years since I published the book, there are responses to globalization, but this has turned out to be forms of, nationhood and glorification of the fatherland, and very, very disturbing developments in the political regimes and cultural regimes of 2022. Again, America, United States, for better or worse, is probably the paradigmatic example of this resistance of globalization to try to assert more white. Since 2016, I wrote the book in 2015, not 2016. So, but in 2016, the beginning of this move towards a return to kind of white supremacy in the United States, which is a terrible development. But the idea of consumerism, and the terrible way that things are advertised, inventing desires that people wouldn't have without watching all the commercials on whatever YouTube or whatever they're looking at. And, it's just, it's an obliteration of sort of the genuineness of individual cultures. So, I travel around quite a bit. It is kind of amazing to see things that I would think are strictly American, kind of advertisements be reproduced in India. So I've been to India several times, and it's really quite shocking, actually. So, obviously, again, Modi is a development of this, again, rejection of globalization, stressing Hinduism over Islam and things like that. And but anyways, but it is still shocking the way that commercialization has taken over.
Right. Going back to, sorry that sometimes the questions are more philosophical, sometimes they're more like.
No, that's fine. Again, this is a shortcoming of the books. I didn't engage more directly with
right.
real forms of violence. I mean, contemporary forms of violence.
Definitely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just one of the, I mean, another philosophical question, let's say, and from the from the more phenomenological perspective, is that, I mean, what's the role of, it was also one of my questions, what is the role of Heidegger in such a mode of thinking about violence? After all, and despite the very fact that Heidegger introduces repetition as repetition of the same, but he's the one who experiences powerlessness, idea that you very beautifully elaborate in the book, the feeling of utter impotence that comes out of experiencing anxiety. Could you please elaborate this relationship?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I don't write on Heidegger very often, but I do know his work pretty well. And but yeah, you're right about the experience of anxiety, I mean, being towards death, the whole division two of being in time. And I think that's a sort of a starting point for a lot of these philosophers that are inheriting Heidegger's mode of thinking. So Derrida being the most obvious one, inheriting Heidegger's thought and opposing it at the same time. But it is that was an attempt by me to invoke powerlessness to, well, again, to stop people from thinking that power in the sense of overpowering political power is what they are talking about or what I'm talking about, to have this starting point in an experience of passivity, to reduce the idea that we are powerful, but also to maintain a guard against trying to reduce everything to the same. It's really not within our power to do that. I mean, at least in the case of Deleuze, I try to do this with Derrida as well. I mean, paralysis in Deleuze is actually a motivation to, it's supposed to produce a motivation to do things. So so again, it's like Derrida with the idea of the impossible, which is, the impossible is again a potency word. I don't know if you're familiar with the late Derrida's writings, where he transforms his earlier formula, which was conditions of possibility and conditions of impossibility, to this nominative version, the impossible. So the impossible is actually, for Derrida, is something that we should try to achieve, even though we recognize that we're powerless to ever really achieve it. For Deleuze, the experience of being unable to think is supposed to motivate us to think more, to try to think what cannot be thought. So those were important ideas for me to appropriate in the book. And but again, to simplify it, I mean, it really is just the stress of the passivity of human existence, like the fact that we're going to die, which Heidegger really, I think for the first time in the history of Western philosophy, really put at the forefront of our thinking. So again, I mean, I tell all my students that Being in Time is the most important book written in the 20th century, philosophical book written in the 20th century, because just nothing, and this is even true of Anglophone philosophy. I mean, a lot of Anglophone philosophy has taken up Heidegger now. So it even seems that what we would call, the French and German tradition of philosophy, which is clearly influenced by Heidegger, even over here, Heidegger has influence in what we would call analytic philosophy. So I think there's some justice in saying that's the most important philosophy book of the 20th century, especially Division 2, with the being towards death discussion. Yeah.
Right. A bit of long question I have here, which is actually the core concept of the book through these three philosophers. You offer three ways of speaking, which will best achieve the least violence, which you appropriate from Foucault, Derrida, and Deleuze and Guattari as speaking freely, speaking distantly, and speaking in tongues. I mean, you speak up these three ways of speaking, which makes the listener or addressee free or liberate the audience. That's a fascinating idea, since this speaking, in a speaking, it's mostly the speaker who is taking turns to liberate himself or herself. Communication is at best a way of letting the speaker liberate. themselves. Could you please elaborate on this idea? I mean, these three ways of speaking, which, as I said, I mean, learning from you that liberates the listener.
Yeah, no, that's really the Derrida idea, is liberating the listener. I mean, it is part of Foucault's story about speaking freely in the ancient Greek culture that he examines in his final courses. I'm a big fan of the final courses that Foucault presented. I mean, I think they're more interesting than the other courses that are frequently discussed, the ones from the 1970s. But anyways, I mean, generally, I mean, for Foucault, it is a liberation of the speaker, because Parrēsia, that's the Greek word for speaking freely or speaking frankly, first of all, applies to speaking to the monarch in a frank way, to resist oppression or to condemn oppression. So it is a liberation of the speaker that way. But when Foucault comes to the early Roman period in his lectures, it becomes much more about the spiritual advisor, basically a teacher, and how do you treat a student. And the thing that really stuck in my mind from this discussion was that Foucault stressed generosity, the generosity of the spiritual director. The wise man would be a very traditional way of saying this, right? So that's how I was able to say that Foucault was also advocating the liberation of the listener, not just the speaker, because it'd be a way of allowing the student to think for him or herself, and speak for him or herself. So it's also true that I don't want to go on too long. You should stop me if you want to intervene. But in Deleuze and Guattari, this idea of stuttering or speaking in tongues, it's a very strange idea. As I said before we really started, I'm teaching 1,000 Plateaus again, and I mean, I'm sure the students will find it's incomprehensible when I try to tell them about it, but it is really an attempt to liberate the speaker, because what they see, they call it major languages like English, German, Hindi, whatever major language of a population. It actually has certain ways of classifying people, right? Again, they have a very complicated discussion of this, 1,000 Plateaus. So, but they think a way of breaking through the classifications is to actually return to the kind of noise that they think precedes any linguistic utterance, to go back to the, as they would say, the linguists would say, to go back to the phonemes, the prior audible elements of the language. So, and to say them in ways that wouldn't be comprehensible in terms of the major language, like English or German. They think it's a liberation of the person's life, their life forces. This is how Deleuze and Guattari talk a lot, their energies, things like that. So it's a very strange idea. I mean, especially for Deleuze, who defines philosophy as the creation of concepts. Certainly stuttering or speaking in tongues does not look that way, except that it could be seen as this is what I try to do in the book, maybe not so successfully, is try to interpret this as still having, the stuttering as having a kind of consistency to it by means of the use of the word and, to, which is a kind of, repeatability or repetition, but one that's supposed to be kind of productive, and I shouldn't say kind of, that is productive and produces novelty. So, I mean, I agree with you. It is aspects of this way of speaking are for the speaker. I really, because the book is motivated by problems of alterity, I really wanted to speak about the listener, write about the listeners. And Derrida is most clear about this. I mean, again, when I saw your prompts, this idea of teleopoesis, speaking distantly in Derrida, it's also a very paradoxical idea. But one of the things I'm interested in is two ways of thinking about friendship or even love. So that, that's what Derrida is really talking about, and is for a friendship that does not reduce my friend to being the same as me. So how do you speak to that person that maintains their alterity, but Derrida makes it spatial, that maintains their distance from me? So so again, this is his use of the contradiction all the time in the lecture course, Politics of Friendship. To say you are my friend and yet to deny it at the same time, so that you're not absorbed into me. I mean, I think it's a common problem in friendship relations and love relations, amorous relations, is a reduction to the same.
I mean, something that is clear somehow in the book, which sort of touches two of my questions, is that, I mean, talking about violence, you don't talk that much about emotions, feelings, and affects. I mean, these things that usually people immediately associate with violence, they are emotions, yeah. And like one of them, I mean, at least in Gilles Deleuze, Nietzsche, and philosophy, one of the very important sides, which is also related to nihilism, is ressentiment. As I can just read the question the way that in Gilles Deleuze, Nietzsche, and philosophy, not only is the first principal form of nihilism, in which reactive forces triumph over active ones, but Nietzsche identifies nihilism and all its forms with the spirit of revenge. We can therefore identify ressentiment not only as a moment when nihilism begins, but also with the reactive life more generally. So the question, although it might be too general, is ressentiment also a reaction, a hyperbolic reaction to violence?
Well, yeah, reaction would be the right word, and hyperbolic as well. I mean, at least Nietzsche's diagnosis of Western culture, up to the 19th century, is one that's motivated by revenge or the feeling of ressentiment. I mean, just what you see about Deleuze, I would think for him, that's the one emotion or feeling that has to be opposed at every moment. That's the worst thing that can happen for a human being, because what motivates ressentiment is that something happens to you by chance, and then it actually damages you, and your reaction to it is to try to suppress the one that caused it, or try to find ways of correcting it, because part of ressentiment is to be always looking backwards. And this is what Nietzsche says, it's always to be remembering. That's why he opens the second part of the Genealogy of Morals with a discussion of forgetfulness. So you can see how this works together with what we were talking about earlier. So if you feel resentment, you're always remembering the past event that damaged you rather than looking towards future possibilities. But of course, the more dangerous part of ressentiment is the reaction to others in an attempt to suppress their alterity, to stop them from doing these things like that. It's not clear to me in Deleuze what the opposite feeling to ressentiment is. He writes a lot about affects, but doesn't really specify what affects are, so to speak, good. But I've been working a lot on Deleuze again the last couple of years. I'm actually working on a new book on Deleuze. It's about half written right now. But I'm going to say, see how successful I am at convincing others that actually he's the opposite feeling to ressentiment is beatitude. And I know a lot of Deleuzians will react very badly to that because it's a religious term. But in Deleuze's writings on Spinoza, but also the word appears in other texts that he writes, sometimes, at least in the English translations. I don't know what happens in the German translations. English translations sometimes render beatitude as bliss, as the English word bliss. I would think in German it should be Seligkeit, but I don't know. I'm not that familiar with the German translations. So, but it is a feeling that comes up a number of times in Deleuze, and I don't know how much you want me to go into this. I'll just try to be very brief about it, and it's an idea I'm still struggling with. But if you know the Spinoza that we learn as an undergraduate philosophy major, beatitude in the fifth book of the Ethics means you feel beatitude when you understand yourself as you are in God, as a modification of God's substance. So obviously Deleuze is Nietzschean. God is being replaced with other things, God is dead type things. But I think for Deleuze, beatitude again is understanding ourselves as we are in the background of experiences, where we're actually more unified with others, in continuity with others. I know I was stressing singularity and individuality earlier, but Deleuze and Guattari are very suspicious of individuality. And I think they're very much more interested in seeing ourselves as we are in a multiplicity. Again, that's a technical term in Deleuze and Guattari, but again, seeing ourselves in a collectivity is where you would feel beatitude. So again, that I hope this is not too confusing. I mean, God in Spinoza is one, but Spinoza allows for these modes to exist. Really talks about modes. So Deleuze is getting rid of the oneness of God and just focusing on the modes, which are a multiplicity. So, I mean, this is also, I'll just stop there. I don't want to go on too long and go into more technical terms. So, but that's my thesis right now, or hypothesis right now. The opposite feeling of ressentiment is beatitude. So,
interesting. I'm really looking forward to reading that.
Let's see if I'm successful at completing the book. So,
yeah, I'm sure. Talking about ressentiment, one practical example was definitely in all the analysis that happened in the aftermath of 9/11. Was ressentiment was also one affect in analysis of terrorism and so on and so forth. But related to that, a week after the tragic 9/11, which was like yesterday was the anniversary attack, George W. Bush had green-lighted an all-out war. I'm quoting him. Let's hit them hard. We want to signal this. We want to signal this is a change from the past. We want to cause other countries like Syria and Iran to change their view, end of quote. And Donald Rumsfeld announced, why shouldn't we go against Iraq, not just Al-Qaeda? It's end of the quote. It's like quoting to politicians. I hope it's not that irrelevant. But in your view, how is the role of the US foreign policy and war on terror, control society related to violence?
Well, I have friends in the Islamic world, and whenever, because I'm American, this comes up all the time, and they always claim that the United States, is doing more violence than the terrorists are doing, which I would agree with that. I think George W. Bush was a terrible president. And I don't know why this wasn't treated. Well, I know what motivated that administration to do what they did, to wage war on Afghanistan and Iraq. But it seems to me it would have been more rational, if I can appeal to rationality, to treat the 9/11 attacks as a criminal case and go to the World Court and try to put Al-Qaeda on trial. And rather than declaring war on Afghanistan to rid them, so they're not a sanctuary state for terrorism. So, but again, I grew up in the 1960s here, so that really shaped me. So my feelings towards the American politics is always quite negative. Even when things seem to be going pretty well, I still feel like things are not as good as they could be. But certainly that period, until Obama was elected in 2008, I think that was a very dark period of the United States, and certainly 2016 to 2020, but also now 22 is still a dark period in the United States. There's just too many, too much resentment, I guess, to put it in a simple way, going on. And but yeah, I was very distressed by what the United States did in the aftermath of 9/11 in 2001. So to wage war. Again, my book doesn't address this very, very directly or clearly, but I do talk at times about peace without peace. Again, this idea of reducing the least violence, and certainly to treat the attacks on these buildings in the United States and the deaths that it caused could have been treated in a very different way that would not have, had such, it's hard to predict consequences of things you do, but still to cause a war, what happened was pretty obvious, it was going to happen. All the chaos in Afghanistan and Iraq that followed, and it could have been treated in a different way that would not have disturbed whatever world order was in place in 2001. And it certainly produced more violence than reducing violence, those actions. So, this is just more me speaking as an individual, citizen of the United States than as a philosopher here. So, yeah.
Right. My last question is not that much from the book, but rather from my perspective and my field, which is on humor. I don't know if it makes sense to ask this question, but can we think of humor as talking about ressentiment as a reactive, hyperbolic mechanism? Can we think of humor as a reverse violence or not? Generally.
I saw that in the prompt. If again, just to appeal to Deleuze, and you probably know this already, that he writes on humor. There's no book on humor, but his writings in the 1960s, especially, he opposes humor to irony. I have to admit, when I've read this, I was very young when I read this. At first, I was quite repelled by this idea because they acted like humor would be. He acted like humor would be. It would be the opposite of ressentiment. It really has taken me a long time to understand this, but it is a sort of mocking of the powers that be, which, again, I don't know if, I'm not in Europe enough. I don't live in Europe, so here, we have these late night comics that come on near midnight, and their whole humor is all directed towards contemporary politicians, basically showing how absurd their actions or their speech is. It's very funny. It's very humorous, but it is a way of denouncing these actions by politicians. And I'm pretty sure that's what Deleuze had in mind. I don't know if you recognize this, but the verb to denounce is very, very present in Deleuze's writings. He's constantly using that verb to denounce this or that. So humor is a way of denouncing. I don't know, when you wrote your thesis, did you write on Bergson on humor?
Not directly, but I was inspired from,
But that in Bergson, in the laughter book, he's trying to show that laughter, that humor that causes us to laugh is actually an attempt to maintain social order. But for him, humor has a very different function. So he says, well, when we laugh at people, and he's thinking, this is written, if I remember right, 1900. So this is just the time of the silent films, so the famous Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton figures are just on the horizon. So he's thinking of physical humor, falling down or slipping off, something, or it makes us laugh. But he thinks that humor is really intended to recognize these abnormal behaviors and to force that person to be normal. So for Bergson, humor is really it's a mechanism of control. So I think this idea in Deleuze of humor denouncing figures of power, you can see that's it's related to what Bergson's saying, but it has almost the opposite function. So so the short answer to your question, I would say is yes. Yes. Okay. So.
Thank you very much for this splendid talk.